welcome back. For this section, the project scale planning, we have a bit of a different structure. We will hear from a group of experienced land managers about their perspectives on planning and managing invasive annual grasses in their area. So I'd like to go ahead and introduce to you that panel. We have JC Arndt. She coordinates the Northeast Wyoming Invasive Grasses Working Group, NUWIGWIG. NUWIGWIG was formed in 2017 in response to the identification of new invasive annual grasses in Wyoming. The collaborative group has combined efforts, funds, and commitments to managing over 150,000 acres of Ventonata and Medusa head. They use constantly improving science to make adaptive management decisions at the landscape level. Next, we have Matt Glenn. He has been a restoration biologist for the Nevada Department of Wildlife for the past 10 years, where he's worked primarily in the northeastern part of the state and is based out of Elko. In his position, he works with both federal partners and private landowners to restore rangelands for Nevada's wildlife, working on a variety of projects with a major emphasis on wildfire, proactive range, and riparian restoration projects. A typical work week for Matt might include developing drill and aerial seed mixes, ground truthing pre-emergent herbicide treatment polygons, counting sage-grouse leks, or working through complex remote sensing problems. Next, we have Reese Irving, who is the supervisor for Carbon County Weed and Pest located in Rawlins, Wyoming. He works in partnership with private landowners, BLM, U.S. Forest Service, NRCS, and a whole host of partners and conservation districts to treat cheatgrass in priority habitat across Carbon County. He and his team began treating cheatgrass in 2014 as part of a mule deer sage-grouse habitat restoration efforts in the Platte Valley. He has since been able to expand these efforts to include other crucial habitats, wildfires, migration corridors, and the BLM's Muddy Creek restoration landscape. Through these partnerships, they've treated 71,000 acres and plan to treat an additional 75,000 acres in the next 2 years. Finally, we have Pete Simic, who is the Habitat Restoration and Cheatgrass Coordinator for the Gunnison Basin in Gunnison, Colorado. He represents seven different federal, state, and local agencies that support his position through an agreement with Gunnison County. He also coordinates, designs, and implements sagebrush restoration projects across the Gunnison Basin, including cheatgrass treatments, conifer removal, wet meadow restoration, native plant restoration, and more. Their local cheatgrass working group began meeting in 2023 due to the increase in cheatgrass infestation across the basin and the concern for Gunnison sage-grouse habitat. About 90% of the global population of the Gunnison sage-grouse resides in the Gunnison Basin. Pete coordinates with a diverse set of stakeholders to implement cheatgrass treatments across federal, state, private, and tribal ownerships. So with that, we will now move into a Q&A with them that will explore a little more in more detail what each of them have been up to. So first off, let's hear from JC and then Pete on what led to the formation of your working group and what did you do to get things started?
Yes, thank you, Erica. I'm excited to be here today to talk about NUWIGWIG. It's a fun acronym at the very least. So the story for NUWIGWIG actually starts back in 2005 when Wyoming determined both at the state level, the governor and multiple agencies across the state determined that we needed a cheatgrass task force in the state of Wyoming. So there's a memorandum of understanding developed in 2005 to make sure that a lot of different agencies throughout the state were coordinating and cooperating in an effort to both educate stakeholders and also manage cheatgrass at the state level. And I introduced this because it actually helped us move forward when, like Erica said, we identified Medusa head and Ventonata in Sheridan County of Wyoming in 2016. And since we already had that cheatgrass task force developed at the state level, it helped us to break off and develop this Northeast Wyoming Invasive Grasses Working Group very quickly. Medusa head and Ventonata posed a different threat than cheatgrass had to the state of Wyoming. We had cheatgrass for years, but these new species had a higher risk of forage loss for both livestock and wildlife, a higher fire danger. Some of these points have already been pointed out by the earlier presentations, but basically we were concerned of the threat of these species at a landscape level and having them invade further throughout the state of Wyoming and further throughout the Great Plains ecoregion. So basically, how did we get a group together? Everybody was scared. There was a large threat from both of these new species being in Wyoming, and it helped us to bring an entire group of people together that could be helpful in managing invasive annual grasses in this area. So as you can see, we go from colleges to local, state, federal agencies, herbicide companies, our Wind Pest Council from multiple counties and at the state level, the Nature Conservancy, right? So we see a lot of different agencies coming together, and that has helped us a lot throughout time because we have both the knowledge, funding abilities, and partnerships that all of these different groups has developed in order to help make a bigger impact in Northeast Wyoming. So I would say it seems a little bit different because we had this new invasion. We wanted to do early detection and rapid response, and there was an immediate interest in managing these species from the group since they were new on the rangeland. But I can say that that threat can be spread kind of across the Western United States in order to get people interested. These species pose a threat, and it's important to manage them, and that's how we got our group together.
Okay, perfect. Well, as mentioned before, thanks, Erica, for the introduction. My name is Pete Simic. I'm the Habitat Restoration and Cheatgrass Coordinator for the Gunnison Basin for Gunnison County. And yeah, I just want to thank the Imagine folks for having me today. What a cool opportunity with this virtual workshop. You know, the Imagine folks have done such great work connecting folks in their efforts to mitigate invasive annual grasses. But yeah, just saving people time and money. Just do it online. Love modern technology. So appreciate the opportunity. As mentioned a little bit in my introduction, the Gunnison Basin are in the pretty early stages of our invasive annual grass infestation. So I hope my story can be relevant to some of you all, because we're just kind of in those primary stages of the development of our local working group and cheatgrass infestation. So for example, a recent mapping effort showed roughly a few thousand acres of cheatgrass infestation collectively across our 600,000 acre sagebrush steppe basin. So yeah, hopefully this is relevant to some of you and can contrast some of the other panelist stories today. That being said, resource managers have observed an increase in cheatgrass infestations over the last decade or two, with cheatgrass starting to move from those roadsides, from those disturbed areas up the hillsides, all the way up to ridge tops. So we're starting to kind of see drainage scale infestations across the basin. So with this increase of infestations across the basin, along with the fact that the Gunnison sage-grouse, 90% of the global population, as mentioned in my introduction, resides in the Gunnison Basin. There is serious concern for cheatgrass in the Gunnison Basin. So that was really the primary factor that led to the formation of our working group. Really the fact that the Gunnison Basin stakeholders here, the fate of the Gunnison sage-grouse relies on our collective and collaborative efforts, really lies in our hands here. So if you look at my first map here that's showed on the screen, you'll see that cheatgrass is fairly ubiquitous across the Gunnison Basin. Definitely some areas like the northwest part of the basin that don't have as much infestation, but and you can see it's definitely ubiquitous across Gunnison sage-grouse occupied habitat, as well within those 2-mile areas outside Lex. And so widespread conversion of these quality sagebrush habitats that are so important to Gunnison sage-grouse to these cheatgrass monocultures, we all know about that cheatgrass fire cycle, would be really devastating to the Gunnison sage-grouse. So the threat of cheatgrass in the Gunnison Basin is just too high to not act now, even though we're in those early stages. I don't think it's ever too early. You know, I think in fact it's better to act early than later. So stakeholders came together in the Gunnison Basin and hired a cheatgrass coordinator, which is myself. This was in the fall of 2022. And the coordinator is designed to specifically focus on cheatgrass across all ownerships across the basin. These agencies are the Bureau of Land Management, Colorado Parks and Wildlife, Upper Gunnison River Water Conservancy District, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Gunnison County Stock Growers Association, Gunnison County, and a local nonprofit called Siskiyou. So pretty widespread there that stepped up and supported my position. And you can see from my second map, you can see this is kind of a breakdown of the cheatgrass distribution across ownerships. Definitely primarily on BLM and private land as well, but cheatgrass definitely extends across all ownerships, including Park Service, state land, U.S. Forest Service, etc. So really all stakeholders in the Gunnison Basin have some stake in this game for sure. So with the funding support from those 7 agencies, I was hired in 2022, and our county commissioners were really instrumental in the development of my position by forming agreements for the county to be the fiscal agent with all these different agencies. So the partners put money into an agreement with Gunnison County. They hire me as an independent contractor, and I effectively represent all these different agencies. And there's definitely been some pros and cons with this arrangement. Some pros are that I can write up contracts without going through the federal IDIQ process. So I definitely have some more fiscal autonomy. And some cons are that applying for funds is definitely a challenge when I'm not housed under any specific organization. So when I want to go after some funds, I need to partner up with an agency and have them agree to apply and house and administer those funds. So I was hired in fall of 2022, and our local working group began meeting in January of 2023. And I'm the chair of our local working group, and our group is actually a subcommittee to the Gunnison Basin Sage-Grouse Strategic Committee, which is an official county committee that's been meeting for about 25 years since the Gunnison sage-grouse was declared a distinct species from the greater sage-grouse. So again, the county was really instrumental in supporting our group by housing us and providing a meeting location for our monthly meetings. We've branded ourselves, Cheatgrass Subcommittee is not a super catchy name, so we've rebranded ourselves the Gunnison Sagebrush Alliance. We found that it was really important that each stakeholder was represented in these meetings. The stakeholders include ranchers, landowners, private organizations, federal, state, local agencies, etc. And we also found that it was really important that each person representing these agencies had a role to play in these meetings within our cheatgrass mitigation efforts. So they were really engaged. They had something to bring to the table, and they had the buy-in with the group. And so the Gunnison Basin saw its first cross-ownership treatment, cheatgrass treatment, in 2021, the Red Creek drainage. This was about 600 acres on Park Service, BLM, Forest Service, and state land. A similar treatment was done in the same drainage in 2022. And now we're planning annual cross-owner treatments within our local working group that are going to happen each year. Additionally, we have an interagency conservation group that really focuses on cheatgrass. They represent Colorado Parks and Wildlife, Bureau of Land Management, and our local district agency here in the Gunnison Basin. So this will be their second year, and they've been really instrumental, that group, in doing that pre-treatment inventory, treating some of those smaller fragmented treatments. So another way we've been able to be collaborative in our efforts there.
Thank you, Pete. Reese and Matt, can you speak to how you have decided where to actively control annual grasses and implement treatments in your project areas?
Okay, thanks for having me and giving me an opportunity to share a little bit about our project and what we're doing in Carbon County. So this all started quite a while ago. We've been doing cheatgrass treatments in Carbon County for a long time. But in 2021, the group that I work with, we really saw the need to look at this on a bigger scale. We'd been doing a lot of 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 acre treatments scattered around the county, and we kind of knew that we needed to have a countywide prioritization plan and look at it as a bigger scale for planning. So this map that we're looking at is just our West Carbon project. Rawlins sits kind of up in the top of that map, and then all those dots are scattered out between Rawlins and Baggs, and that area covers about 750,000 acres, and it's about 70% public land in there. So when we got to that point, that we knew we needed to do some more planning, the first step we had was we need to get inventory. We need to know where the cheatgrass actually exists and start putting some bars on that. So I spent a couple days in a helicopter, and those are all the light colored dots that are in the middle of that map. And sorry, it gets a little bit busy because there's a lot of data in there, but those light colored, it's just a presence or absence. I flew in the helicopter. Every time I went over a patch of cheatgrass, I dropped a point just to start giving us an idea of what we had. So after we did that, we also got involved with Imagine and having their monitoring crews come and help us. And that's what all the multicolored dots are. And those are all estimated cheatgrass cover. So anywhere from zero and trace up to 60+%, I think. And JC will talk a little bit more about their monitoring protocol. So I'm not going to get into that today. But what we did, and if we can go to the second map, is we took all that data as a group, and it was myself and BLM, Game and Fish, conservation districts, and we kind of looked at it and overlaid it with both sage grouse core habitat, which is the blue, and then mule deer migration corridors, which is the purple. And then we also looked at other things such as high value ag grazing, previous and ongoing disturbances or treatments, whether that was conifer encroachment, controlled burns, wildfire. And then we tried to use all that information to start building what our priority areas would be. So you see those different colored polygons, those are our priority areas that we came up with. The red ones being top priority, and then kind of going down, and you can see that on the edge of the map. And our thought as we started building that was to contain the cheatgrass and work in these high value areas that didn't have a lot of cheatgrass, try and protect that and push that towards this middle blob of points and west where we had higher densities of cheatgrass, and it was going to be more intensive to manage that. So that was how we came up with our initial prioritization, much like what we've heard from earlier today, looking at all the factors. It was a mindset of how we're going to prioritize this, what's important, and then this is just kind of the spatial representation of that. So from all this data, after we kind of had our prioritization set a little bit, we can go to the third map. What we get from all that data is this heat map. And while we didn't necessarily use it for our prioritization to begin with, this is a really helpful tool as you look at those areas, where you want to protect, where you want to treat, where your high densities are. If you look down in the southeast corner, that little blob down there that's mostly green with a little bit of yellow, if this map or if that data had been taken in 2021, it probably would have had a lot more red in it, but we'd already started treating in there from some previous monies that we had. And so it's kind of neat because this map actually shows how it's changed, that it's not red anymore, that there aren't any red areas, that we've started doing treatments in there, and we've started making that conversion from a heavily infested area to a lower infestation level and cleaning some of that up. So looking at all of this, if we go to the fourth map and how it kind of fits in with defending the core. So we didn't have the defending the core maps yet at that time, but you can see how our prioritization areas really fall into that concept, and using those factors that we came up with, it really worked out well. And you can see the dark blue, those are our high priority areas. We're moving to the west to some of the growth opportunity in other areas. And then it's really interesting if you look down in that southeast corner again, where we had started treating. If you look at that now, most of the cheatgrass in there has been treated. So we may be moving that area back towards core habitat. So that growth opportunity was there, and we're trying to realize that at this point. So that's kind of how we went about prioritizing this large project, and thinking about where we were going to start and work to.
Sure. So Matt Glenn, habitat biologist here in Elko, Nevada. So appreciate everyone for having us today. And from a wildlife perspective, and working for the Nevada Department of Wildlife, almost everything that we do has to have some sort of wildlife nexus. And what you're looking at here on the map is a Brownian bridge model developed from collar data. And where it says 7 animals in red in the legend, that probably actually illustrates closer to the greater portion of like 2,000 mule deer that will move through this area. And this is just an example. Typically for the Nevada Department of Wildlife, we're always, like I said, we're always looking at wildlife habitats and where those uses are and kind of prioritizing range restoration in those places. Several other things that kind of go into play or come into play are the themes of this this webinar, and that's grow the core, protect the core. And what you can't see is a little bit obscured by the Brownian Bridge colors there is the darker green to the right of the screen represents intact brush communities. And we're working right on the periphery of that, kind of identifying project areas to improve habitats. This side is largely co-dominant perennial grass with cheatgrass with a little to no brush component, which is actually a fair representation of a lot of Nevada. We don't have a lot of areas where there isn't cheatgrass or winter annual invasion, and so we're kind of tasked with looking everywhere. And so we're a little bit more opportunistic. I don't think that we can work towards the complete annihilation of winter annuals in the state of Nevada. We work around it, and I think that we look a little bit more opportunistically. Site potential is a huge thing for us. Climate change, quite frankly, is a big deal for us. We have some places that are getting as little as 2.5 inches of precipitation annually now. And so we have to be thinking about all of these things. We've started working, and I should mention that so much of this work happens because of our federal partners. We work with the BLM hand in hand. We've been working with them since the early 90s and really working on our pre-emergent program for the last 10 years, getting to where we are now. Wildfire restoration is another huge piece where we implement pre-emergent treatments and again kind of prioritizing wildlife habitats. And then, like I said, on these more proactive projects where they might be old fires that didn't respond well, we will look at where the brush component is, where it's intact, what the site potential is, and how we can build on those. So here, we, as a wildlife agency, we have to work within the site fidelity of our wildlife species. So the same mule deer that were on the last slide are going to end up down here, and this is like 40 miles away from there even, or 30 miles. And you can see both of the remote sensing data sets are relative cover of brush. And so in the last one you saw there was some intact brush that was proximal or close by. Well, this is what some ecologists might call a cheatgrass wasteland, but we can't tell mule deer not to show up here. They're going to come here every year despite the compromised nature of the range. And so we have to, as a wildlife agency, endeavor to improve things here as well. And so that's where we kind of get away from the protect the core, grow the core model, and we're kind of tasked with a really difficult workload in trying to improve near monocultures of cheatgrass. I think that's probably the gist of where we kind of, and I should say before I say that's the end, but how we prioritize things. We do this for a whole suite of wildlife species. It just so happens that mule deer seem to be an easy one for me to tackle today.
On this next question, we'd like to hear from you all. How do you decide on treatment approaches and what factors do you consider when making those decisions? If we could hear from Pete and then Matt, Reese, and follow up with JC.
Yeah, that's a really important question. And it's something our group has been thinking a lot about lately, especially being so early in our infestation stages here in the Gunnison Basin. So we were lucky enough to have the Imagine folks come down to Gunnison last October and do a workshop with us. And we did an exercise where all the stakeholders in a room, there's about 40 people representing all these different agencies in the room. They're asked to call out some of their most important defining factors that they consider when managing landscapes in the Upper Gunnison Basin. And it really got us starting to think about how to prioritize areas for treatment. And during our discussion, we're trying to wrestle with this idea of defining our core, which is challenging when in such an early stage of infestation in the Gunnison Basin. So, one thing we seriously considered defining the entire basin as core habitat. As it meets all the criteria for core, having low levels of infestation, having intact habitat, and being critical habitat for Gunnison sage-grouse. The entire basin is occupied Gunnison sage-grouse habitat. However, when we did this, it wasn't very helpful from a management or planning perspective. We were kind of at square one after this, right back where we started. And Brian Mueller, he helped us start to think about prioritization a little bit differently, more from a habitat perspective. So dividing up the basin based on habitat importance and value and management strategy. So if you look at my map, for example, if you look at the northwestern part of the basin, this is an area that is really important habitat for Gunnison sage-grouse. So you can see this density of leks in this area, but has low levels of infestation. So the management strategy in these areas might be improving brood rearing habitat and doing really rigorous cheatgrass inventory and monitoring to detect any early infestations. Another example is that 2-mile area around the leks, which you see here in baby blue. These areas are really high priority for cheatgrass treatment because about 80% of hens will nest within that 2-mile area around the leks. So dense, continuous sagebrush, expanses of sagebrush are really critical in these areas around leks. So these areas are high priority to treat those cheatgrass to make sure that there's not a conversion to cheatgrass monocultures in these areas. So when we're planning these treatments, one thing we do is we'll identify a drainage, say, that has infestations throughout this drainage. Then we'll draw a big polygon around this drainage. It'll be maybe 1,000 up to 1,500 acres at the most. And then we'll hand that polygon to our local conservation crews here, and they'll get boots on the ground over a course of a couple weeks and do some more fine scale mapping within that 1,000, 1,500 acre area. And then they'll give that fine scale map to a contractor. So then the BLM Fuels Department, this is how we've been doing it. They'll put out a contract for bid, and a large crew will come out and they'll ground treat that 1,000, 1,500 acre area using that finer scale map of those cheatgrass infestations within that larger area. And then they'll often stick around and treat the adjacent ownerships around that BLM area, which includes Forest Service, private land, state land, just to ensure that entire infestation is being treated. And this year, a crew called Silhouette from Medford, Oregon, they'll be coming out and they'll be taking care of a lot of the larger private treatments, which you'll see on my next map. Outside of BLM, we have the most cheatgrass on private land. So it's really important that we engage private landowners. And we've got some funding to be able to treat cheatgrass on private land for free. So really trying to take advantage of that and have a larger crew come out and take care of a lot of these larger private land treatments. And the funding for these cross ownership treatments comes from all over the place. So of course, the BLM Fuel Shop, but also Colorado Parks and Wildlife Habitat Partnership Program, contributions from local nonprofits, Use in Fish and Wildlife acquired funds, et cetera, et cetera. So just kind of piece together these treatments from the funding that's available, and allocate some funding for chemical, allocate some funding for certain ownerships, and kind of make it work that way. We'll then utilize our smaller conservation crews to treat more of the smaller treatments, the more fragmented infestations across the basin. And then we always coordinate with our county to get the roads treated within the treatment area, just to ensure the highest success rate of our treatments. And for factors that might affect our treatment planning, these might include the presence of ESA-listed species like Gunnison skiff milkvetch, areas of critical environmental concern, landowner willingness to participate, et cetera. And some factors that we think about when we're prioritizing areas for treatment are wildfire risk, proximity to wilderness areas, proximity to leks, like I mentioned, critical big game winter habitat, and high use areas that may act as vectors. And mentioned before, right now we're just doing ground treatments with backpack sprayers. This is definitely quite an expensive method for treating weeds. And we are getting mixed results with these methods. I'll talk a little bit about that later, but we do have a current EA right now for aerial application, and Indaziflam is also included in that EA to use Indaziflam and aerial application on BLM land. So hopefully can start rolling out some of those methods here in the fall.
All right. So again, as a wildlife agency, we're kind of tasked with viewing everything through a wildlife habitat kind of optic. And so again, we'll use mule deer. This is the same kind of case study of the first sites that we were looking at earlier. But what we look at first is a wildlife habitat. Second is a crucial habitat. And then how can we improve it? What is the potential there? Is it on private? Is that wildlife habitat potentially on federal land? Is it on private land? And then your kind of avenues for permissions and or NEPA analysis are different. And is there NEPA already in place? Those are kind of like the first steps, like you kind of take a look at. And then you get into the brass tacks of like treatment. You go out there and field truth a site. And I should say or mention here where we're a little bit different. We're viewing almost every treatment as a full restoration kind of prescription lens or optic, because almost every time we're tasked with treating winter annuals, we also have to seed or implement seedling planting or something like that. And so we're looking at the ground not only as like, can you fly it with aerial herbicide? Is it fixed wing application? Is it rotorcraft application? Can you get a drill cart there? So can you drill seed it? Does it have to be aerial seeding? And what is the potential success for all of those things? And then at the end of the day, what is the associated cost with those things? And so the planning really is goes pretty deep. You know, your desktop analysis looks at everything from ecological site descriptions to soil profiles. We're fortunate enough to have a soil ecologist here on staff when we're looking at so many of these different variables. We're looking at resistance and resilience. We're looking at what treatments like can we implement that will give us that resistance to reinvasion into the future. And all of these kind of things give us different inputs, and it makes it really complex because we're not just treating the winter annual itself, we're trying to implement this revegetation. Again, you can see that in the dark green, I apologize for that, is your kind of core brush habitat. We're working right on the periphery of it. And if you notice, there might be a little bit of a buffer in there where the brush densities aren't quite as high. Well, that might be because topography doesn't allow for the revegetation component, or we couldn't fly it with fixed wing aircraft or what have you. So like I said, this is a heat map for brush, and then the black polygons are your project areas. I should have mentioned that first. And so if we can go to the next map. Here, you're looking at the same relative density, but for annual grasses. And you can see to your east where annual grasses are lighter, and then we work into heavier winter annual densities and where we need to improve things. If you noticed earlier, this was the middle of that mule deer migration corridor. So this is super important and why we're working there in the first place. Go ahead to the next slide. And again, I don't want to call this a wasteland. My game biologist would probably really frown upon me calling this a wasteland, because every year approximately 2,000 deer will show up here, but you can tell by the heat map that the shrub cover is not high. That's dark green is your, your higher shrub covers, and then red or the lack thereof any color would be no shrub color or no shrub cover at all. And so historically, this was a Wyoming sagebrush site and has burned several times, which is another consideration in planning and what sort of revegetation tools might work. But this site is an especially difficult one. But again, because we are a wildlife agency and approximately 2,000 deer will show up here, we are tasked with trying to improve this. There's the annual grass cover. I will say that this remote sensing is 1 meter resolution, and it was implemented in the aerial imagery was flown in a year where we were in the middle and depths of a real drought cycle, and nothing grew. So I'm not sure that this is really a fair representation of annual grass densities on the landscape, but you can definitely tell they are present, and this is all the winter annual grass that is present here as cheatgrass.
So as far as our approaches in Carbon County, I'm not going to get into a lot of depth on the actual treatment because it's pretty straightforward what a lot of people know about. Rejuvera applied with a helicopter. I will point out that we're treating everything on that kind of east edge in our priority areas that has a trace of cheatgrass up to the 30-40%. And it's all in intact perennial ecosystem. So we still have intact perennials. When we take out that cheatgrass, those come back, they recover on their own. So it's a pretty straightforward herbicide application. The one thing that I will say is something that can really affect our treatment approaches and where we treat, how we treat is compliance, where we have 70% public land in that area. The federal NEPA process is a huge component of where we treat and why we treat. So as far as that goes, the one thing I can say is work with your federal agencies early. Start that planning process really early because it does take time. If you don't have aerial NEPA done, you have to work through that process to be able to do that. And then also think outside the box. I've been very fortunate to have some great federal partners that aren't afraid to do things a little bit different. Our BLM for several years has been working on doing block clearances for aerial application. So instead of looking at it on a project by project, they are working to clear entire watersheds or even bigger areas in some cases. And that really gives us flexibility in where we treat. If we have a wildfire that pops up and it's a known cheatgrass area, we can go and treat that if it's in that block clearance. We don't have to wait to go through an additional NEPA process. Another thing that's a little out of the box that most people haven't seen is our Forest Service actually was able to do a large cheatgrass treatment in wilderness area. So they undertook that. The range specialist did that and undertook that process, and it was a lengthy process, but she was able to get it done. So don't feel like you're hamstringed by some of that stuff that you can't treat somewhere because of federal regulation or federal lands and the NEPA process.
And I'm going to hit on something a little bit different as well, really quickly. Some of the panelists have already spoke about how their areas of treatment and their approaches really apply to the core and either growing the core or protecting it and having that, high quality mule deer or sage-grouse habitat. And while we do have a wildlife habitat in Northeast Wyoming, the major component of our treatment approach depends on a containment zone approach and EDRR framework. So in this map here, you can see with the red polygon is our Ventnada containment zone. And then the smaller green polygon is the Medusa Head containment zone for Northeast Wyoming. So our goals, our treatment approach in Wyoming is if there's Medusa Head or Ventnada anywhere outside of the containment zone, it gets priority treatment. That treatment usually being Rejuvera or Indaziflam at a 5 ounce per acre rate. That's what we've found works best for us. Within the containment zone, it depends a little bit. So with Ventnada, we're trying to treat as much as possible, just trying to cut down those populations, especially on the edge of the containment zone, and get them treated. So you can see a lot of different colored polygons within that red larger polygon, and those are about 150,000 acres worth of treatments that have gone out since 2018 on more specifically Ventnada, but some Medusa Head sites as well. Within the green polygon, you can see our Medusa Head priority is eradication. So anytime we see Medusa Head, we have funds basically pooled within the New Wigwig group to target Medusa Head treatments immediately. So at no cost to private landowners, to make sure that we're working towards eradication on that since it's less widespread. With Ventnada being a little more widespread, we're focusing more on reducing it, containing it, trying to manage it within that zone. You can see these blue points outside of the containment zone are actually Ventnada populations that have been found in the last couple of years that were treated with the pooling of our funds, and then also 2 Medusa Head points outside of the containment zone that have also been treated. So I just wanted to point out from a little bit different perspective, our goal is to protect the core and the fact that we maybe don't hold the most core for Northeast Wyoming, but we're trying to prevent it from moving throughout the rest of the state where there's actually some really high quality core habitat. And more of an impact could be seen with both wildlife and livestock if we allow Vetenata medusa to move further throughout the state. So we really move from an idea of protect the core and contain and eradicate.
And this next question, we again would like to hear from all of you. How do you determine if treatments are successful and where follow-ups are needed? Let's start off with Pete.
Sure thing. So any treatment larger than 20 acres on BLM, which is where the majority of our cheatgrass treatments are, is required to undergo pre-treatment inventory and post-treatment monitoring. So in those areas, we have a pretty good sense of the effects of those treatments. And the two main metrics of success that we're looking at is one, a decrease in cheatgrass cover, obviously, and two, native perennial bunchgrass release or increase. There's some other metrics that we consider as well. Antelope bitterbrush leader length, that's a big one, especially for our ungulate species here in the Gunnison Basin. But primarily bunch grasses and cheatgrass are the two metrics we're looking at. And we definitely prioritize areas we've previously worked in for spot treatments. This year, we're going back to Red Creek and treating those areas just because we did find significant amount of cheatgrass within that treatment area from 21 and 22. Just because we've invested so many dollars and resources in these areas, we just want to make sure those dollars go as far as possible. So yeah, making sure that that investment gets some return and really finishing that project, making sure we eradicate as much cheatgrass as possible within that treatment area before we move on. And this has been a challenge with the ground treatment, the back-to-back spraying, because cheatgrass is pretty volatile in the Gunnison Basin. You know, we're a high elevation basin, pretty cool, definitely get some wet, cold winters. So some years we'll have a really poor germination of cheatgrass, and other years we'll have like a bumper crop, you know, it just comes up everywhere. So if we put out a contract on a year with spotty germination, you know, we're paying $350 an acre for ground treatments roughly. And you know, for 1,000-1,500 acre area, and only the areas that have where cheatgrass germinated that year are getting treated. So areas that might well have a cheatgrass soil seed bank in the soil are not getting treated, even though there is that cheatgrass seed in the soil. So we might see those areas germinate the following year, even though we spent, you know, $250,000 the previous year on a contract to get that area treated. So that's definitely been a challenge, and follow-up treatments are especially important in those areas that are being used with ground treatments and backpack sprayers. Very critical in those treatments. We are going to change things up a little bit with future contracts. We're going to write in that all bare ground needs to get treated, just so we can account for that volatility of cheatgrass germination. And we're also having our local university here, Western Colorado University. They're doing some research on the vegetation and soil seed bank response to indaziflam and mazapic to understand the herbicide effects here on our local flora.
So yeah, I'll just touch base a little bit on the importance of having your pre and post monitoring. We pretty much expect that we're going to have to do retreatments on parts or all of our first treatment. So having that monitoring in place before you start is extremely important. And building the capacity for that is another thing that can kind of be a hindrance. I've been fortunate enough to be able to work with Imagine and find some funding for that crew to help us with our monitoring to facilitate all those points that were on those maps earlier. But if you don't have that pre-treatment data, it's really hard to show where you're going, especially in those areas that have very low densities of cheatgrass but are still important to treat. And your monitoring doesn't necessarily have to be really time consuming. I think JC maybe will get into a little bit how they do the monitoring, but you know, some photo points, some ocular estimates with maybe some more in-depth monitoring scattered in there that just shows you trend over time is really what you need for the big scale management decisions and when you're going to need to start retreating, if you need to start retreating. And then the other side of that is a lot of the funding sources anymore are requiring that you have some sort of a monitoring plan in place. So you need to have that at the beginning. Folks are going to want to know how you plan to do that when you apply for your funding. So make sure you have that and that you're planning to do it for 3, 4, 5, 6 years post treatment. Maybe not year 1 or year 2, especially with Rejuvra. Any of you that have applied it and maybe had some questionable weather that year, you know that it may not look great in year 1 if you didn't get enough moisture on it to get it incorporated into the soil. So being able to show that yes, it did work in year 2 is really important. And then also we've had some treatments where that cheatgrass, kind of like Pete has talked, has moved around. So we went in, treated, thought we had it all. And then 2, 3, 4 years later, in areas adjacent to what had been treated, we had a flush for some reason, particularly in a fire that we're dealing with right now. It showed up on north facing slopes that used to be timbered. We had no idea it was there. And then when we went back in and monitored 4 years later, we found it. So now we're going to go in and treat that adjacent to what we've already treated, but just shows the importance of that monitoring, having the pre-inventory data where you can, and then doing it for, again, 3, 4, 5, 6 years post-treatment to watch for that break and plan a retreatment if you need it.
Matt, if we could hear from you and then finish up with JC on this question.
So again, as a wildlife agency, we're looking at if it's successful, it's functioning for wildlife, and so or it's trending that way. And I think where some groups are looking to get rid of cheatgrass or winter annuals altogether, I think for us, we've been successful if perennial grasses have stabilized the site and cheatgrass is the lesser component. We ultimately want to see brush there in the Great Basin and within Elko. These biomes have brush in them. We're supposed to have brush in them, and so the wildlife depend on those things, and that's where we really kind of determine whether we've been successful. But you'll see in this photo here, this fire burnt in 2017 just east of Elko, and it was treated with Imazapic on the left side of your screen, and then the right side of the screen, because the land status was not. You can't see it super well, but on the right-hand side of the screen, you can see a bunch of annual grasses out there in the distance, and that's largely cheatgrass. On the left side of the screen was treated with Imazapic. It was drill seeded and aerial seeded after 1 year of fallow. You can see that after several years, 5, 6 years, it's holding strong against reinvasion. And so to us, that's really being successful. And I think that in Nevada, we're just looking for cheatgrass to be the lesser component. We know that it's going to come back. But if it is, like I said, the lesser component of the overall composition, and we have brush and a good amount of perennial species in the mix, that is success. So what you're looking at here is an aerial seeding of sagebrush post-wildfire. I believe this was taken just a couple of years ago, but this seeding happened in the early 2010, 2012 period. And if you look in the interspace there in between those lines, that's what you would have if there was no aerial application of sagebrush. And like I said earlier, as working with the BLM and looking at most of the sites in Nevada, we're looking at not just pre-emergent application, but we're looking at a revegetation and full restoration prescription kind of story. And so you could just imagine if there was no aerial application of sagebrush here, everything would look like the interspace in between those lines, and there would be virtually no sagebrush. I think it's a great illustration of the importance and need for aerial application of sagebrush, where you have wildlife species that really depend on it. Again, working for a wildlife agency, we love to see things like this. We love to see brush back into the system, and I think this illustrates what can be done.
All right. I'm going to hit a little bit more on monitoring and using monitoring to determine if treatments are successful. So besides being coordinator for New Wigwig, I also help coordinate the monitoring network for Imagine, which has been talked about a little bit before. Before I really dive into things, though, I want to point out that monitoring doesn't have to be intense. I know there's some more intense protocols available, but any sort of monitoring counts, right? So if you're taking a picture in subsequent years after treatment just to see if it worked or not, like Matt showed, having proof of a management strategy on the landscape is important. You can get more complicated or less complicated using line point intercept, reading cover, how many points you read monitoring information in a landscape, right? You can really get more intense with it, but it doesn't have to be. I would say the most important thing is using monitoring to strategically plan treatments or retreatments if you need, and make decisions for adaptive management using that monitoring data. So basically building a protocol that fits your needs and what goals you're trying to attain with your monitoring protocol. So with that, I'm going to jump in a little bit with what our monitoring looks like with New Wigwig and with Imagine in general. This is our treatments within Sheridan County, Wyoming. So you can see we have a lot of different treatments over the last 6 years. Some of these actually being retreatments. And basically we use our monitoring protocol, which is a plotless ocular estimation. So basically stand within the field and determine what the cover is of independent invasive annual grass species in about a 10-foot radius around yourself. And then the same for a pooled perennial grass value. So that can show us basically what cover looks like across the landscape. So instead of dropping a few points or doing more intense monitoring in independent points, our protocol moves to put a lot of points across the landscape. So we have a pretty short protocol, but we can get a lot of points, and then we can develop maps that look like this. So kind of like the heat map that Reese talked about. But this is basically on one landowner in Sheridan County of Wyoming. And you can see each panel, there's 2021 monitoring, 2022, and 2023. The right side polygon is treated in 2020, and the left side polygon that's like kind of an L shape was treated in 2021. So you can see for that monitoring year, how many years after treatment we are. So 0 would basically be within the treatment year using indaziflam. So just 1 year after treatment, you can see that we have 51% perennial grass cover. And in the pre-treatment, there's about 24% annual grass cover. And then if you move to the second panel, which was 2022 monitoring, you can see that we saw an increase in both of those. So indaziflam does last in the soil for multiple years, so we would expect it to maintain that control of annual grasses, but it's also actually increasing perennial grasses over time. An interesting thing is if you move to the third panel, in the third year after treatment, we actually start to see a reduction in perennial grasses, and that's why monitoring is important. Initially, when we started using indaziflam, we were told it could last up to 5 or maybe even 6 years sometimes. But when we started conducting our monitoring, we found that 3 years seems to be the point where efficacy starts to decrease, and therefore we basically keyed that in to be our retreatment year so that we have 0 tolerance of seed production for Ventnata and Medusa head. Right? If we are working towards containing these and eradicating these species, we don't want any new seed to be produced each year so that we're fully depleting that seed bank. So if we move to the next slide, we can actually see what Ventnata looks like in that same location. So again, 1 year after treatment in the first panel, the darker red it is the higher Ventnata cover. So 1 year after treatment, we have about 3% in that pasture versus pre-treatment is about 26% cover of annual grass or of Ventnata specifically. 2 years after, we actually see a small increase just by 1%, so maybe some redistribution across the landscape. But since we're doing a lot of points across this pasture, you can key into that darker red area on kind of the southeast portion of the pasture that maybe we're just not getting great, we didn't get great control in that area. So maybe when we do look into retreatments, we don't have to retreat the entire pasture. We can maybe dial down to specific areas. Moving from pre to 1 year after treatment, we see a 23% decrease in Ventnata cover. And then in 2023, like I said, that 3 years after, we start to see a little bit of an increase in those annual grasses, and that really keys us in to do our retreatment. So I would just say that monitoring is important for a lot of reasons. If that's seeing how effective treatments are across the landscape, right? If we only took one picture or laid down 2 or 3 transects across this pasture, we might miss some of the Bentonata that's occurring in very specific locations across this pasture. I mean, just to give you an idea, the 2020 treatment is about 1,000 acres, right? So we could cover that in about a day with a crew of interns. But if you have more intense monitoring protocols, you might miss maybe what's happening across the entire landscape. So there's some pros and cons to different monitoring protocols. But again, I just want to really focus on the point that it's important to develop something that's going to help you meet your goals and ensure that you're seeing the success that you want to with your invasive annual grass treatments.
We have our final question here, and we might have time to get to a couple of other questions after this, but what role does budget and funding play in your decision making? And what are some approaches you have used to acquire and stretch funding? We'd love to hear from you all. Let's start with Pete and go to Reese, Matt, and JC.
Sure. In the Gunnison Basin, we've really relied on our partnerships for funding, piecing funding together for these cheatgrass treatments. So really relying on each partner to bring their own funding sources to these cross-ownership treatments. And 2 of our major contributions for funding sources have been the BLM Fuel Shop, so considering cheatgrass treatments as fuels treatments, and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service securing some of the bill funding for cheatgrass treatments in the basin. And to be honest, it's helped a lot that we do have a threatened species whose 90% of their global population's in the Gunnison Basin. That's been a great talking point to securing funding. So for us, that's kind of been the core of our justification for the use of this funding. So, I think it's really great wherever your management area is to identify an area that identify a factor that kind of brings all the stakeholders together and is kind of a mutual and collaborative goal, whether it's a threatened species, wildlife habitat, et cetera. And we've had contributions because we have a threatened species in the basin. We've had contributions from bird conservation nonprofits, Colorado Field Ornithologists, the Mule Deer Foundation. We've utilized state funding such as the Habitat Partnership Program. And in 2023, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service secured some bill funding for cheatgrass treatment on private land, totally free of cost to the landowner. So the first time we've ever been able to implement something like this in the Gunnison Basin. So with this funding and all the other agency funding, we've been able to piece together some cross-ownership treatments, and that's been hugely critical. So we've really had plenty of funding available in the last couple of years with this sagebrush ecosystem grants, bill funding, IRA funding, et cetera, and just really relying on partners to bring their funding sources to the table whenever applicable has been really successful. So I would say funding is pretty ubiquitous right now. Right now, the limiting factor for us is capacity within the agencies, and I'm happy to talk more about that later. But.
Okay, so for our funding stuff, and one of the things that Pete talked about was one of their limiting factors is the capacity within the agencies to do contracting to get this work on the ground. So one of the things that we've done, I'm sure there's a lot of people on here that have done this or are involved in it, but we use a lot of cooperative agreements with our federal agencies, with our other partners, to run all of our funding kind of through one central place. And that's usually us with Carbon County Weed and Pest. But all the grant funds will come through us. All the federal dollars will come through cooperative agreements and good neighbor authority agreements. And then it enables us to just do one contracting process for all of the treatments that we're going to do in a year. And it really streamlines that process. My contracting requirements are a lot quicker and less than the federal agencies. So I can go through contracting in a couple weeks or a month versus having to go to a regional office with a federal agency and go through that lengthy process. So that's really helped us get money on the ground in a timely manner, utilize funds, especially when they're restricted to the amount of time you have to get them done. So that's been a big help for us. The other thing is having plans in place before you even go after the funds. So, if you don't have a program or don't have a lot of a program, just start planning now. Plan like you're going to have all the funds that you need. That's been a huge help in securing money for us, especially on the west project that we've been working on, having that prioritization in place, having some of our inventory data in place before the funding opportunities ever came to us helped us get the funding. And that's a $3.8 million grant was the one that started all that. And because we had everything in place and we're ready to go when that funding came and we were boots on the ground ready, we could start spraying that year. We kind of filtered to the top and got a big chunk of that funding. So I would encourage you to start now, whether that's small or on a large scale. Start working with your partners, start planning, start working on getting your NEPA done, because all of that will help you secure funding in the future. And then the other thing is, just start somewhere. For us, starting with 500 acres here, 1,000 acres there, 2,000 acres there, it just kind of snowballed, and it got to the point where now folks come to us and say, hey, I have this pot of money. Do you guys have a spot that you can use it that fits these parameters? And so now we can just take those pots of money. We have our prioritization in place. We know where we're going next, and we can really get that money on the ground in a short amount of time. And then, as it was said in the Q&A before lunch, that how to incentivize prevention, but it really starts here. It starts with your planning, and then you can go after those pots of money. And once you have that plan in place, it's going to be incentivized because people are going to help fund that when you have a solid plan already ready to go, ready to be on the ground.
Matt, do you have thoughts on that?
Sure, thanks. So I'll try to be brief because I think a lot of this will just be redundant from what the other folks have said here. I think this is kind of a universal topic for a lot of reasons, but I would just say, from someone looking at it from a holistic restoration perspective, number one, I think be smart with how you can potentially match federal dollars to make your monies go further. If you're working for a state agency, I think again, working towards full restoration prescription piece, being careful and wise in how you spend money that can either not or be used for ground disturbance activities or what have you, and just being efficient in the use of those funds, I think, is an important piece. So much of funding that we use either comes from Pittman Roberts or sources like that, where there are stipulations that were around how we can use those funds, and we have to be smart in how we utilize those monies. And then lastly, I would just say, on a more practical application piece, be creative, and then also think about how you can always be thinking about how you can save money to do more. And I'll just give a brief example. When we first started using Imazapic, we were using as much as 8 ounces per acre and flying it on with as much as 10 gallons of formulation per acre. And through the years, we have found out that if you go all the way to the bottom of that label rate of 2 gallons of formulation per acre for aerial application and 6 ounces of Imazapic, we're actually getting the same or meeting the same objectives and levels of control. And for our purposes, it works just as well. What that means is the plane can fly faster, it can cover more ground. And so there's less fuel costs, less application costs. There's obviously a lesser herbicide cost there as well. And then at the end of the day, all those cost savings don't mean we're putting any of those dollars in our pockets. They're going back on the ground. We're augmenting our polygons and doing more with those funds. So I would just leave you with that. Try and be creative and think about weways you'd like that you could potentially save and do more.
And I'm going to discuss something a little bit different that our group has gone through. We're thankful for all of our partners and their commitment to find very interesting ways to get funding. So about 80% of our treatments that have gone out in Northeast Wyoming have been through the help with NRCS EQIP funding. So that's Environmental Quality Incentives Program. Our partners with NRCS initially found an interesting way to look at the fact that Vent Knot and Medusa Head are threats to environmental quality due to, the increase of fire or decrease of habitat for sage grouse. You could go on, but because of that, NRCS has been basically the majority of our funding for treatments, and they allow us to do pasture-wide treatments on private landowners that are willing to buy into that program. There is some difficulty with that because NRCS also requires a grazing deferment following invasive annual grass treatments. So that's where some of our other funding options have to come in to fill those blanks that NRCS can't meet, or producers that can't meet that grazing deferment requirement. So some of our other groups like Wyoming Game and Fish, Forest Service, Wyoming Weed and Pest Council kind of fill in those other gaps where NRCS can't meet those needs. And that also gives us a little bit of flexibility. It takes about a year for NRCS to make those plans. So they're great for treating Ventonata populations that we know exist, and we can use that year to plan accordingly. But when we find brand new populations of Medusa head or populations outside of the containment zone, we can use some of our other funding options to treat. So having that flexibility in different funding to meet those different needs is really important. But I would say that EQIP funding has been the biggest win for us in Wyoming, and we thank the NRCS our NRCS partners for that.
Great. So we actually wrapped up a little bit ahead of time, so we can get to a few questions, maybe one or two from participants that have come in. So our first question, it was initially directed towards Pete, but it might apply towards the rest of you if you feel free to chime in. So Pete mentioned that cheatgrass and bunch grasses are the main metrics of success in the Gunnison Basin. Do you see any other invaders coming in after treatment? For example, cheatgrass goes away, but Medusa head comes in. And how do you monitor to make sure something like that would be detected?
Well, I wrote a brief answer in the reply in the Q&A section, but yeah, someone else might be able to speak on this a little bit better that has Ventonata or Medusa head in their management area, but we hardly have cheatgrass, let alone Medusa head or Ventonata, thankfully. So we're going to do our best to keep it that way. But yeah, we've had a really great response from perennial grasses after our treatments, and I think it's because the Gunnison Basin with our infestations, the cheatgrass, it can get to maybe 20% in certain areas. That's about as high as it gets in terms of coverage. And it's kind of interdispersed with that native plant community with native shrubs and perennial grasses and even forbs as well. So when we do, and luckily we don't have any annual forbs that are super critical to our wildlife here in the Gunnison Basin. So I think all those combination of factors make for a really great and successful treatment. So we just have that perennial bunchgrass seed bank in the soil, and when we treat with a pre-emergent, it really controls those annual plants and allows those native perennial plants to really establish. So we've seen a great response there. But maybe someone else can speak on Ventonata and Medusa head.
I did want to add something. It's actually maybe a little bit less with Ventonata, but invaders in general. We've seen in some of our invasive annual grass treatments, we get rid of all the invasive grasses, so we don't really see a problem if we treat for Ventonata. Cheatgrass doesn't come back in, but we do sometimes see perennial invasive forbs come back stronger. So we've had issues with leafy spurge or sulfur cinquefoil, right? When you open up that space after you kill the invasive annual grasses, if the perennial grasses don't have time to properly recover and those perennial noxious weeds are already present, we sometimes do see an increase of those. But frankly, that comes with managing something on a landscape and these diverse ecosystems that, we keep it in mind. But managing a patch of leafy spurge may be a constant fight, but it may be something that's more established than managing Ventonata on a couple 100,000 acres. So weighing the pros and cons of those and keeping an eye out and using multiple management techniques for all of your invasive weed management together.
Great, thank you. I think we have time for one final question. And again, this is kind of open to whoever would like to chime in. But what kind of GIS tools do you use to map invasive grasses, how the invasive annual grasses respond to your treatment, and if they're spreading?
I can speak to this one a little bit. We do have a GIS specialist on our team, so don't quote me on a lot because she covers most of this for me. But all of our monitoring data goes into helping either ground truth, remote sensing information that's already available, like using rangeland analysis platform. We sometimes see issues, especially at high elevation, having RAP information match up with our ground truth information. So we're also looking at using other imagery sources like planet imagery, Sentinel data, and Landsat to see if we can build models that show invasive annual grass cover, basically using our monitoring points to develop models using newer or different imagery sets so that we can move forward on that and get better outcomes. I would say if you have more questions on that, Chloe Matilio is our partner with that, and she would be much better at answering those questions. But it's definitely a concern. It's something we're looking at. We can't monitor everywhere. I mean, we basically hire a team of 10 interns that cover the landscape all summer, and we don't hit nearly enough of Wyoming to monitor all the work that's being done. So getting some GIS tools established that are a little bit better at estimating annual grasses so that land managers can use those to make decisions is definitely a goal, but I'm not sure we're quite there yet.
I would just expand on what JC said a little bit. We work very closely with JC and Chloe on the modeling that they're working on. And I think that's a goal, is to have something in the future that gives us a idea of what we have and where it's at. One thing that we've found with all the different models is it really doesn't replace on the ground inventory work, getting out there and actually seeing what you have on the ground before you start doing treatments. So I think they're a great tool for a starting place. Where do I need to go to start to look if you don't have that data already? But then it's a matter of taking that and getting out there and putting boots on the ground, or even aerial surveys like we've used in the past. If you're just looking for presence and absence, where am I going to start treating? What drainages need treated? That's a great place to start.
I can just add real quick a couple tools that we use in the Gunnison Basin. One thing we use is field maps. So the entire BLM office, every department has field maps on their phone intended for noxious weed inventory. So on their phone or tablet, if they're out wherever they are across the basin, they can inventory a point line or polygon of a noxious weed. And then on the remote sensing side of things, we just had a map made for us by a company called Open Range Consulting out of Utah. And they created a few layers for us. One was cheatgrass percent cover, but we also got sagebrush percent cover, bare ground percent cover, and perennial grass percent cover as well. So we haven't had the opportunity to ground truth that map yet, but it seems to be really accurate, just overlaying that with known infestation. So this winter, that's been a really great prioritization tool, just looking at areas that have low sagebrush cover and high cheatgrass cover.
Great. Thank you so much. It looks like we've reached the end of our time here to the break.